Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from around the world. Welcome back to Creation Conversations. It's great to have some people watching already. Do get involved in on the chat as we go forwards. We've got the full team tonight as well as we deal with a topic which is perhaps more controversial than it really should be. As Glenn said earlier, the sort of answer to the question we're asking this evening should be answered in sort of seconds flat. But we're going to spend a little bit longer on that topic tonight as we delve in just a little bit deeper into the realm of what a species is, what a human is, what about things like Neanderthals, where do they fit, and so on and so forth, and kind of tying it in with not only a scientific picture, but also a biblical picture. So I'm looking forward to this topic this evening. But before we do that, let's run round the group and see how we're all doing, because we're, again, spread out all over the world. And I'm still in Jersey, technically on my holidays, but I have been doing some rather interesting exploring at the same time. But let's head over to Australia first. John and Craig, you're still together, still working hard?
We are certainly working hard. Have you enjoyed your time up here, Craig?
Oh yeah, being worked like a slave, but not too bad.
John does that to you, I know by experience.
My reputation is being in tatters now, Craig. So what have we been doing?
Oh well, we've been out to Nature Works, which was really interesting. That's a model producer, really high quality models made out in Brisbane right here, and really lovely guy that we met out there. Very passionate about what he does, and hoping to get a few models.
I reckon so. And we've had a homeschooling day at our new museum, and a few slides will be coming up shortly. And we've been busy with reviews and new bookworks and things like that, correct?
And paperwork.
And paperwork, yes.
All
the inevitable paperwork. I still, like Diane, remember when they said, now that we've got computers, we'll get a paperless office. And we have tons of waste as a result of these computer printouts and all the things we need to check. So the scripture says false prophets should be stoned. I'm not sure if that applies to people who prophesied the computer age, but in reality, their prophecies are so far from the truth, it's not funny. So that's basically what we've been doing. We will sort of bring up more slides a little later to give you a ministry review and then touch on the subject we're going to deal with on how many species of man there are, because we've got a few technical things we need to introduce as well. In fact, I've even bought some bones and I bought some skulls, and we'll be, I mean, our brother Glenn over there in the USA is almost, he's tornado bound. We're all going to be having things to do that are interesting today and deal with hard rock science and soft definitions that are too soft sometimes. So that's basically what we've been doing down under, and it's actually been cool, isn't it, Craig?
Yeah.
Look, he's got a woolly shirt on. For Australia, in Queensland, at this time of year, leading up to Easter, that's unusual.
Great stuff.
That, by the way, was the last office worker.
This is what happens when you work for Creation Research, isn't it? Well, Glenn, how are you doing? I heard tornadoes there. Is that?
Yeah, we're doing fine here in East Tennessee. We've got nice weather today, but our son in Little Rock, Arkansas, and our daughter-in-law, they're going through tornadoes. They've already had one pass by, miss their house. Now they've got a second on the way, so they're hanging out. Just pray for them.
Keep them in prayer. Absolutely. Yeah. Diane, how are you doing?
I'm reasonably well, thanks. It is autumn here. We actually have 4 proper seasons where I live in Australia, which is further away from the equator than Queensland. So it is turning cool, which means I've got all the windows shut so you won't hear the birds and frogs and insects and various other things that have been intruding.
They were quite musical last week.
Yes. They were. Yes, indeed.
Great stuff. Sam, how are you coping?
I'm fine. I've got a new microphone. I hope I'm coming through nice, loudly and clearly. But yeah, so hopefully the days of cutting it in and out audio will be long gone. But yeah, I'm fine, doing well, working hard. So I'm looking forward to the weekend, most definitely this week. But yeah, I'm doing good. Thank you.
Great stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff. Yes. Well, it's a great topic that we're going to be delving into today. For those of you who have just joined us, we're going to be asking the question of how many species of human are there? And as Glenn said earlier, this should really be a question that is answered almost immediately in a very, very simple answer. But it is actually a fairly controversial topic, both in the secular world as well as now recently in the creationist world, where there are many, obviously, secular evolutionary scientists who claim there are multiple species of humans or homos or hominids, right, in the scientific language. And there are also now some creationists which are also promoting the idea of multiple human species. And it gets very confusing, particularly when you try and use evolutionary assumptions to argue that there are multiple species of humans, but then try and fit them all into not only a young Earth, but everybody descended from Adam. So we're going to be dealing a little bit about what a species is. We're going to be dealing a little bit about what a human is, and delving into both the biblical and scientific aspects of it. But before we do that, let's just run around and have a brief ministry update from everybody who's been involved in ministry recently and get involved. So, Glenn, why don't we go over to you first, because I know you've got some exciting slides and things to share. So let me just pull them up for you, and then you can let us know what you've been up to, apart from avoiding tornadoes.
Yes.
There we go. They should be coming up just any second now. And Sam, I'll leave it to you to do full screen. And there we go.
All right. Well, went out with a colleague that had gone out previously with to look at the polystrate trees. This time we went to a site not very far from our house. And one of the things, it's a road cut. And you can see these slabs here that have fallen off. They were horizontal. Now they've turned vertical, but you can see the ripple marks. So this is a fossil with the flow you can see from them. And it's just a thin veneer of deposition there that maintain those flow patterns. Go to the next slide. The reason we went out there, this isn't very clear, but on that road cut, you've got seeps coming down the road cut, and it's just coating the rocks with iron. So go to the next slide. We thought this would be a good location to bury a few objects and to see how long it would take for them to fossilize. And you can see some of them in there, little teddy bears, gloves, mask. Figured everybody now is going to recognize what a mask is. We're so sick of wearing them, so thought we'd put them to good use. But there were two locations. Go to the next slide, because the second location was really this beautiful stream coming down with all the flow stones that are developed, these little pools with the dams around them. But instead of being calcite, as you oftentimes see with hot springs, this is just leaves, pine needles, and they've all solidified from the iron just being coated and then fossilized into iron. So it's these iron flow formations coming down. Go to the next slide. And at the top, it's this, I think this was an old mine that is filled up with water. And where it was spilling out, where he's standing, that is just a little dam that has formed from all the leaves that have collected and fossilized. So this is where we're setting some objects out. You can go back to me. Unfortunately, the previous person that was set out got fossilized. And so I got their fossil here. That's my April Fool's joke. For those that are in Australia, it's April Fool's Day, right?
We don't know. We're not fools out here.
Right. It is April 1st over there. It's April 1st for us tomorrow. But anyway, yes. It's confusing when you go all around the world. Anyway, moving on. John and Craig, what have you been up to? Shall we get your slides up so you can let us know some exciting results?
Okay, now I go down. You ready for me to go?
I am indeed.
Okay. Yep. Now
click on PowerPoint.
Right, click on PowerPoint first. There we are. That's good. Okay, there's our logo, courtesy of Sam, and with our creationresearch.net website, etc. on. So we'd encourage you to go, but we make no apologies in discussing the species of man today. Our aim is Christ, who created the first man, and Christ who came to die for that man's sin and its effect on all of us. You'll see the banner logos across the top, and Easter is coming up as a good reminder of that, and that's where we'll probably end up this evening or this morning over here. Craig Hawkins has been up in Queensland, and you're quite right. Hawkins and Dawkins are related names. They're both about hawks, hunting and things like that. But there he is at our casting place where we visited this week. And yes, we would love for $6,000, that was the offer made to us, to get one of these giant goannas. We have a mural in our park of one of those, but theirs is a little bit bigger than the one we've got. We love that sort of stuff. We have a few little relatives. Oh, do you see the python there in my greenhouse this week coming down for a visit? Now, the interesting thing, of course, is when you look at our snakes, and I've got lots of snakes around here, you see their forked tongue? Now, Joseph is the expert on this, and we might have a whole program one day on snakes and venoms and things like that. But in reality, I have them all year round because it's fairly warm. They may disappear for a week or two in winter to keep warm out of the cold wind, but that's about all. Do you see their beautiful tongue? Now, I always love to put my hand out so they can lick me. Well, they don't quite lick you, but they smell you on the way, and these guys are fairly friendly. What's interesting, of course, is I've got the two pictures. There's Craig there with the giant goanna, and there's the snakes, and even the evolutionists have reached the conclusion that snakes with their little legs are descended from some sort of goanna-like monster. Yep, that's the latest theory here in Australia. And we wouldn't be too critical of that because the Bible talks about snakes that used to walk in the Garden of Eden and then being cursed. And the reptile family is still the biggest group of leg losers on the planet. Well, Craig and we had a group of homeschoolers yesterday at our new museum, our new Creation Discovery Centre, and they were having a wonderful time, and they were looking at some of the skulls that we'll get to today. And of course, one big thing about homeschoolers is you don't need too many families to fill up the place. They usually come equipped with their own crowds, and they had to ask questions. You see our nice glass cases with a reminder that the human at the top in that display case has smaller brains than our fossil relatives. And by fossil relatives, I mean fossil humans. Neanderthal and the others are huge brain compared to us. And people find that fascinating. But how many species does that make of humans? Well, there's one of the dads, and he was looking at Velociraptor cast on the left-hand side there, and compared to the actual cast of the skull. You know, we don't have the real one, but you can make do with some of these really accurate casts to get across one point. The Steven Spielberg movies have fudged it. The real Velociraptor is chicken size. Like the toy on the right there, there's the actual cast of the skull held by Diane Eager, and there she is holding the model. We showed you that last week as we were setting this up. Well, it's interesting. We've had two groups there now, just in the last week or so, all fascinated by the fact that when the Bible says watch out for false science, that's exactly what it means. And come a week or two, we should have the cast of the original Velociraptor skeleton. No feathers. Did you catch that? No feathers. And notice the drown position, which we will keep people talking about all the time. Reptiles that drown usually fold their tail over the top and then their neck, and they get buried before they can relax in their muscles. Rapid burial and drowning. Well, the kids were having a wonderful time yesterday as one of the families as they looked at the fossils on the wall and answered questions. You see, our museum is designed to make them muse, old Greek word meaning to think. Amuse means to not think. A meaning not, muse meaning to think. You want to be amused, you don't want to think at all. You want to let your brain go loose. We want them to think because the first commandment is you'll love the Lord your God with your heart, your soul, and your mind. Of course, in our museum, we've had some wonderful volunteers. There's Karen helping us set up a couple of weeks ago. And we do have volunteers. So for those of you in Aussie who live not far from this museum, which is out at Archerfield, just on the southwest edge of Brisbane, we do need volunteers. We do need other fossils donated. You've got ancient tools, you've got some archaeology, then we need donors, not just with physical things, but you want to support. There's all sorts of ways. We don't often appeal for funds, but if you want to make sure you can fund this and help us fund it, then there's all sorts of ways, and you can find them off our website, creationresearch.net. Now, I happen to have today my colleague Craig here, so we'll take ourselves off here and get back to us live. We don't need the slides anymore.
He'll get us down.
You'll get us down? There we are. Where have we gone to, though? There we are, back here, down the bottom. Down there. Whoops. We're having trouble with Craig hitting buttons.
We can see you.
We can't see you. There we are. That's it. All right. Now, Craig, if you guys want to make Craig and I full screen, we have an official duty prepare, which is actually going to introduce the whole of the topic. Craig, would you like to make a presentation here at the moment officially so that the world can see that we've been given automatic ownership, temporary rights of this fossil?
That's correct. And officially handing over one of our seahorse fossils that Joseph brought back from Arizona via the UK a few years ago, finally made it to us via Diane's luggage. And we're going to donate one of those to the museum.
In fact, we know it's a seahorse because, well, let's put it right beside. That's one of the seahorses, dead seahorses from your farm.
That's right.
That's a dead seahorse in the rocks. Now, because our subject tonight deals with fossils and humans and how many species there are, Craig, can you tell us something about the classification of seahorses? What's the name of this guy here from your seahorse farm?
That one's the scientific name is Hippocampus,
right,
which basically means horse sea monster.
Horse. There's not much of a monster today, is it? Right. And what about this guy here, the fossil one?
It's also called a hippocampus.
Oh, right. So they're both hippocampuses, which I believe is the genus word.
It is.
And in fact, for those of you who don't know anything about species, we better tell you that the original classification dealt with the real creatures, and it had a binomial. The guy who invented this system solved the problem the ancient Greeks could never solve. They had words like asparagus, but they never could figure out how to classify vegetables. They used the color of blood, but some creatures had green blood, and that didn't work either. It took a Christian guy, a creationist, who believed that God had specially made things, hence the word species. And then he found that some species of creatures, like foxes and dogs and things like that, actually fitted into a broader category. So he invented the generators, or the genus. So as we talk tonight about species and genus, don't get lost in those words. They are invented by a Christian. They have a creationist basis, and their basis is God created, and he created things to produce their own kind. Oh, I've got a question. A guy called Samuel Rafinesque in 1810 invented what word? For a free trip to Seahorse World next week, when you go home, what's the answer to the question? I just found this out this morning, by the way. I'm not really all that smart. I just looked it up. Well, the answer is hippocampus, right? So he was he wasn't even trained. He never went to university. He had no qualifications whatsoever. And if you look up Wiki or some of the encyclopedias, you'll find that all through his life as an academic, yes, he was undoubtedly a polymath, is what the European universities would call him. He was superb in so many disciplines it wasn't funny, but he was self-taught. And he tried and tried and tried to get his ideas published in the American scientific literature. And you know what the result was? The authors, the editors would automatically, if they saw his name, they would automatically reject. He had no qualifications. He had no education. And yet we now use his classification because he turned out to be right. Right? So hippocampus, Rafinesque, totally untrained, But boy, what an academic, but only known after his death for the quality of the work that he actually did. So you might be famous one day, Craig.
Well,
but you've got more qualifications than Raffinesse did. You've got your masters in forestry and all that sort of stuff, right? You got how many years experience with seahorses?
20 odd.
20 odd. Okay. Well, look, tonight we're talking, or today over here in Australia, we're talking about species and genus and how many species of. Well, I'm going to hold this one up. Dr. Diane Eager, if you wouldn't mind coming on screen now. Perhaps I could ask you a question. This is the guy from Germany, Diane, and kicked off a lot of this. How many species of human there are? What do you remember his name?
Neanderthal or Neanderthal. Yes.
That's good. Now I've been to Neanderthal, the actual place, and it's in Germany, and it's actually famous because of a Christian, right?
Yes,
it's
indeed.
named after a Christian. Do you remember his name?
Yes, Joachim Neander. And
Okay,
Neanderthal actually means Neander's Valley. So it's the name of the place. It's not the name of.
That's right. Neanderthal actually it relates to Old Anglo-Saxon Neander's Vale or Neander's Dale. They're all related words. And Neander was Joachim Neander. What's he famous for, Diane?
Well, if you have a classic hymn book, you will find his name in it, Joachim Neander, as the author of a wonderful hymn called Praise to the Lord the Almighty, the King of Creation.
Right. So there's another little bit of wonderful Christian history that's blatantly ignored in the scientific literature. But do you remember the classification of this guy? What's he actually regarded as, human or what?
Well, it's interesting that over the years that has become disputed. The official classification is Homo neanderthalensis, but even amongst the evolutionists, there is a movement to classify Neanderthals as being part of Homo sapiens. So Homo sapiens, Neanderthal as a subspecies, and that's a debate that's bubbling along in the background.
So no Christian should want to take Homo neanderthalis and make it a separate species from Homo sapiens sapiens. That's us, by the way, the wise man. We are very egotistical in classifying ourselves, but this is what happens over the years. The actual classification can change. So don't get caught out by the experts changing this. In fact, I'll be honest, when I did geology at Queensland University, and some of you know I went and did genetics as well, I was a bit of a dilemma to them because they didn't know exactly what I was. I was actually trying to be a copy of people like Raffinesse. He knew an awful lot about an awful lot of things, so he could apply his knowledge right across the field. Now, I may not know as much about seahorses as Craig or Raffinesse or anything, but it was very useful to have a very wide education, scripture, and the real world as well. Now, Diane, there's one other question I've got to ask you. If I have a fossil, now, what's the problem with classifying a fossil right down to species level, given how we define species in pragmatic biology? What is a species?
Well, in the living world, species is usually defined as a group of organisms which can interbreed with one another, but not with other species or other creatures. So the separation is whether things can interbreed. Now, of course, with fossils, you can't do that because they're dead.
Yeah, and, very simple fact of life. And there are no transgender dinosaurs. There are no gay fossil fishes or anything like that. You've got to remember that, folks. Hence, we support Richard Dawkins totally when he's come out and said there's only male and female. He's 100% right. In fossils, there's not even that many of the times, unless you have the whole fossil preserved. If you've only got a rib bone or what, it's very hard to even be that dogmatic. So one of the things I learned after years in geology and specializing in paleontology and coal is that the best you can do in geology is have what's called a morphological species. So if you find a bone, you describe it as best you can, but then you don't attribute sex to it. So if you don't attribute sex to it and you can't actively watch it doing anything, then you can't be dogmatic about what a species is. So if I have this guy here, Homo erectus, and oh, by the way, the brown bits. What did we decide the brown bits were, Craig?
They're the bits that have been found.
Yes, it's hilarious, really. We've got a bit of the back of his head, and the rest of it is artistic license beyond a shadow of a doubt. So when you look at that there, we've got a bit of his front piece here, a bit of his back, and the rest is just dead head artwork. So Homo erectus. Dr. Eager, back to you. If I say Homo erectus and I put it beside Homo neanderthalis, what have I just said to the ordinary person? What have they heard in me saying that words that way?
Well, they would think that those were both species of human beings because that the genus name Homo, most people know that that means man or mankind. So they would assume, oh, well, they must be different types of people.
So therefore, I can create a whole family tree just by using the wrong words or the right words, right?
And I've got a couple of examples of that to share later on.
Later on. But see, it's important that we establish before we go any further. If you want to talk about how many species of humans there are, then you need to know whether you're talking about fossil ones or you're talking about real ones that are alive today. Because I'm old enough to remember reading in the literature that the Aborigines were regarded as a separate species of human, despite the fact that the sailors in the early days took Aboriginal wives and very successfully had children with them. Well, I don't think you'd call them wives because they just shacked up with the women. And the reality is the history books tell us many of the women were happy to do that because the sailors treated them better than they'd been treated in some of the parts of Tasmania. I know that's provocative. I know it's controversial, but it's in the actual records itself. So don't run away from real history about real people in real time. Okay, so we've got fossil people and we've got real humans and we've got multiple races. Oh, I know that's an unpopular use, that word, but they are separate. The Jewish people regard themselves as a separate group from everybody else, and they're very proud of it. So when we have a look at tonight's subject, I'll perhaps ask you one more question, Diane, before we hand over to you to deal with what you brought along tonight. I brought in some bones. Now, I know you've chastised me a few times for holding them up the wrong way up. There's a guy who's doing handstands there, right? But we recently had a physio who retired from practice and donated all these to our museum. So if I'm going to deal with a human being, Diane, and we know what a human being's hip joint looks like, how would this differ if I was dealing with an ape or a ape human or a human ape, as some of the so-called creation groups like to terminology? Why would this hip be a significant factor to know?
Well, that hip is designed for human beings that stand upright. So you need to look at it in terms of the soft tissue around it, but even the shape of it, the that rounded, flared. Yes, if you hold that up, that's the hip bone, what we call the hip bone. Well, you can see the socket of the ball and socket joint, which apes have as well. But the way that the femur, which is the long leg bone with the ball and socket, fits together is different. If you hold that up there, can you see there's between the ball and the main shaft of it in an ape, that sort of strut there is a lot longer and it's offset at a different angle because apes can stand on two legs and they can actually walk for a short period of time on two legs, but their hips never actually completely straighten out, and neither do their knees. So their weight is not distributed properly through their hip bones or through their hip joints and through their knee joints as well.
There's one other feature that they donated that I looked at this and I thought it looks like a dead jellyfish hanging down connected with cotton. But you said this is wonderful evidence. If you're going to classify a fossil as a human and you've got a foot, right? Because that's what that is. How would that help you classify something as Homo or non-Homo, Diane?
Well, the main difference is in how the big toe and the other toes are aligned. In a human foot, they're all lined up together, and the big toe is tightly bound to the rest of the toes, so that that front part of your foot actually, when you're walking, takes your whole weight each step of the way. And also between the heel and the toes at the front, there is an arch. Now, that's obviously just been strung together with, I presume, with pieces of nylon.
I think that's right. I think that's right. One bit's come undone, but yeah.
If you push that all together, it will actually form an arch shape that's built into the bones themselves, and then it's reinforced with the ligaments and tendons that hold it all together. And that's one of the key features of a human foot, is that we have an arch. And arches are strong, so that helps hold up our weight when we stand. And also it gives the foot some flexibility. It gives a bit of give in it when we walk. And apes do not have that. They have a flat foot, even if they have a heel. Yeah.
So if I hold up Neanderthal again for the last time, reminding you that he came from Germany, and I've been to Neanderthal, the valley itself, and the latest version of him, well, you've seen on my pictures, he's a blue-eyed, red-haired, very Celtic-looking human, and he's got normal feet. So it's not just a portion of the skull. If I want to know if somebody is human, as in Homo, as in species, human being, then I would look at their foot as well. The final clarification, if I only had their fossil, correct?
Yes, we have enough Neanderthal bones to know that they were fully human, and people who have studied them, and we can do things like scanning them all in now and seeing how they would fit together and how they would work, because we can see where the tendons and ligaments actually attach to them. And whenever scientists do that, they come out with the results. Well, this all fits into the normal human range. We've written a fair bit about this in our fact file of studies of their hands, their feet, their jaws, and things like that. So that's worth going and looking at. Just put in Neanderthal in the search box, and you'll find all sorts of things like that. Yes.
Last question, Diane. Then, in the desire of some people to make multiple species of humans, what we're finding at the technical level is the more you know about these legitimate fossil humans, the fewer number of species, even the evolutionists are reducing them to, even Neanderthal. Now, okay, Joe, back to you.
Yeah, great stuff. Thanks for that, John and Diane and Craig as well. So that kicks us off to a really nice start. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing in the last few days, but in reality, the last few hours as well, to get you a little bit excited for what I'm going to be talking a little bit about later. But I think it's probably time to, if there are any questions knocking around, to deal with some of those before we move on to a little bit more in-depth study, as Diane's going to bring us some slides and stuff from the Natural History Museum in London. So let me just share an exciting one or two brief little updates. This is where I have been just earlier today. It's actually one of the largest and most complete prehistoric, for want of a better word, sites, burial chambers, but also religious chamber as well. And we went inside here just a little bit earlier. You've got to crouch down quite low and crawl yourself all the way through, and you're sort of about 25 to 30 meters inside. You're about 30 to 40 meters underneath the ground at this point as you're digging and exploring around. Now, Jersey is well known for its many prehistoric sites, including Neanderthals. You see, when we're dealing with terms like this belongs to something called the Neolithic, which is the new stones, right? The new age of stone, the new stone people. And then you have the Mesolithic, the middle stone, the Paleolithic, the old stone, and then you've also got the Neanderthals knocking around as well. And all these terms can be very confusing, and you've also got to try and think, well, how do we fit them into a biblical picture? So we definitely need to deal with the idea of a Stone Age at some point during creation conversations. Maybe that's a whole topic to delve into. But today we're talking about things like Neanderthals, because you see, Neolithic people, Neolithic farmers are regarded to be the same as modern humans. And then you have Neanderthals, which are supposedly contemporary with those that are considered to be modern humans, but they started off being considered as maybe in man's evolutionary ancestry. Then they were considered perhaps their sort of distant cousins, and many people still consider them that today, sort of distant cousins, branched off from a common like hominid. Yet there are also secular scientists today that refer to Neanderthals as Homo sapien variation Neanderthalis. So we can also ask, well, what does this variation mean? Where is the line between a species and a race? And, you know, there are people out there, including creationists today, that don't really like the term race and think that we shouldn't use the term race in talking about these people. So we really do need to delve in a little bit deeper into this, which is what I'm going to do a little bit later. Stunning architecture, by the way. This is completely lined up with the equinox. So during the equinoxes, both the spring and the winter equinox, the autumn equinox, it lines up, so the sun shines in through all the way directly into it. So it's really beautifully designed. You've got this enormous chamber which you'd walk into. You sort of start off crouching down, and by the end of it you can stand up, and it's opens up to this huge area inside, which has then been buried by enormous amounts of rubble and then completely covered by an enormous amount of soil. So it's this huge, great big mound that you can go in and actually explore. And things like this, albeit on a smaller scale, are found all over the island. This is another one which was right next to one of the big prehistoric Neanderthal sites that we visited. There's been lots of caves where we know we've found Neanderthal activity and Neanderthal tools and Neanderthal culture. And so it's not just the bones. Obviously, Diane and John and Craig have been speaking a lot about the bones, and that is a very vital part. But human beings are more than just bones. We're created in the image of God, which means we have certain aspects that animals do not have, including things like creativity. And that's another aspect that we need to look at when we're comparing whether something is a human or not, or somebody is a human or not. You need to look at what characteristics do they show in terms of the social side of things, in terms of the creative side of things, in terms of, do they bury their dead? Do they have a form of government? All these things are uniquely human things. So we can compare things like Neanderthals to that as well, which we'll do a little bit later when we get to the question, what is a race? Exploring Neanderthals, the origin of races, species, and everything else as well. But that's for in just a little while. So I'm going to stop there for now and come back to us. And perhaps we should have a time for one or two quick questions before we end up, hopefully, has that stopped sharing now? Or is that still sharing? There we go. I think we should have time for one or two quick questions before we move on to Diane's segment. So, Sam, have we got any questions? I know we've got a bit of going on in the chat.
No.
Oh, well,
no, hang on. Well, no, one from Redbroth Baptist has just come in.
Excellent. Good to see you, mate. It's been a while since we've seen you on here.
Yeah, I know. We were just discussing that in the chat. Redbroth Baptist says, whether or not they admit this, would different races of humans constitute different species by evolutionary standards?
Diane?
Well, again, this is this issue between people who want to split up species into subspecies and then make them into different species, and people who want to lump them all together. And this is something that goes on in biology all the time between the splitters and the lumpers, they're called. And in fact, that's what has happened with Neanderthals. As we found more and more evidence with Neanderthals, more and more bones, and looked at what Joseph said, look at the archaeology, because we have studied their living spaces, and it's very clear that they had well-organised living spaces. We found bits of clothing and things from their cooking pots as well, now that we can do various studies of the chemistry. So yes, We've gone from classifying them as separate species, and a lot of the evolutionists want to put them back into human beings because the evidence is just overwhelming. So this is an issue that's going on, and the evolutionists actually argue amongst themselves quite a lot behind the scenes in the professional literatures. So even though in the popular literature it's all seen as, yes, this is what we know, behind the scenes there's an awful lot of arguing going on. And this is an ongoing problem with how you do classify things. And that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about now.
It's also worth pointing out that even under secular, you could call it evolutionary academic standards, race and species are two different things. And race, they're both scientific terms, and they're both terms that we can relate with in the real world, even though the term species is debated back and forth over an exact meaning. And quite frankly, there probably isn't going to be an exact meaning because God did not create in species. At the end of the day, God created each and everything according to its kind. You'll find, as we mentioned earlier, kind is related to the Latin word genus, which is where Carl Linnaeus lifted that word from. But species is a special form of that kind. And so you'll find that the standard sort of most generally accepted term for species is a thing that is able to breed with others within its genus, but tends to be isolated geographically, right? That tends to be a standard, generally accepted term for species. But race is one step lower. It's the lowest unit within a kind that can all breed and interbreed effectively and easily, right? So it can be the result of degeneration, it can be the result of isolation, and so on and so forth. And so you'll find that the term race is not only a scientific term, it's also a historical term. And you can trace this back. We've done many, many programs on the history of race, right? And you can trace it back through the languages. It actually originates in the Hebrew, and you talk about different heads that are in the Bible and stuff like that. So we can discuss a little bit more about that. But if you take it at its face value terms, race and species are two different things. Now, can you take the concept of race and be racist with it? Of course you can. Can you take the concept of species and be evolutionary with it? Of course you can. But it's worth taking a step back from that and actually looking at the terminology of what these two things mean, and going kind of into this discussion with a clear mind. You got any comments on that, John?
Yeah, just one thing you sort of glossed over there. Linnaeus, who gave us the binomial system, two names, genus and species, didn't just borrow from the Latin, he borrowed from the Latin of Genesis chapter 1, because the common version then was not King James, right? The version you would have read at university was the Latin Vulgate, and you can look it up because I've looked it up, and God made each creature according to its own genus. In Hebrew, it's min. In English, it's the related word kin, kin as in kind, and that's how we get our word separate kinds. So when people say, oh, kind is undefinable, Linnaeus would have disagreed with you because he got it straight from the word genus, and you hate to go from one thing which looks like a King James word only to genus and say that's scientific. No, it was stolen, it was borrowed, it was begged, it was taken in its entirety out of the book of Genesis as a creation of God. The original human man was not only a species, he was a genus. You can't go any further because there was no other parts of the system that would have existed, but he was both genus and species, and he's given rise, the Bible is emphatic, to all human beings on the world today, and some by degeneration. Now, we don't like admitting this because I've had university students, even one kid sadly sitting in a wheelchair, and I hadn't even known he was there, but we were dealing with the history of the world is the opposite of evolution. It goes from perfection downwards. So when I was born with pyloric stenosis, I was degenerate, right? I have no problems applying that to myself, but he hated that concept because he was in a wheelchair. He was crippled up with some sort of disease in his legs. And he said, I'm not degenerate. I'm just another variation of man. Well, he's certainly variation, all right, but he's been robbed of the truth by evolution that sees everything as doing that. whereas in reality, the biblical picture does this, and sometimes to the point of where species become really out of the same kind. They just cannot physically mate. So Craig and I were talking about chihuahuas, right? Now, chihuahuas are in the dog kind, but they can't breed with Great Danes. The poor old Great Dane would suffer heart failure trying to mate with a chihuahua, and the chihuahua would actually die of overstretch trying to actually reach the Great Dane. So they are physically separated, and you could technically say, because one of the definitions of species is separated by geographic isolation until only the features in that original one become the dominant features, say, on an island. And you would say that's a separate species until you actually take the chihuahua and take out its sperm, etc., and find that it can mate with a Great Dane. And the same is true with some human groups. I mean, you look at, say, the pygmies in Africa. They live in the jungles. Why? Because they're short. They live in the jungles because they get chased by their big ancestors, the Zulus. But the pygmies can run through the jungle and the Zulus can't, right? Same linguistic basis, etc. But yet they still could actually interbreed if they weren't always fighting historically. The big people, let's be blunt, we discriminate against the dwarves in Western society, and the same is true in Africa. The big people discriminate against the little people, almost to the point of where you can say they're separate species, but they're not, right? It's an arbitrary system, and it's sort of, you've got to avoid that in a discussion of how many species of man, because as far as I can see, and probably the team as well, one species of man in the beginning, one genus of man, and it hasn't changed since then. What about you commenting on that, Glenn or Diane?
Just, I'm in full agreement. We are one species. God made us unique, but we're all the same. We all have one mother. The Bible says Eve was the mother of all the earth.
Well, that's good, Glenn. I'm glad you agreed. You've kept your job, your position on the creation research team. That's great. Diane, any comment?
Yes, I agree with Glenn. We are all the descendants of Adam and Eve, and but yes, simply because groups have been separated out for various historical reasons. One of the most important, of course, was the scattering after the Tower of Babel, and then groups would just interbreed with one another, so that you do get distinctive ethnic characteristics. But human beings are all one species, but there are different subgroups within that, which we sometimes call races, and that's just a scientific observation, that there are distinctive characteristics because of geographic and sometimes social isolation. As it happens in the modern world, where because we're all traveling now, that's we're mixing and matching a lot more. But
so would you go one step further, Diane? Let me push you to the wall here and say, when it comes to living humans, it's easy to prove that they're one species, right? Interbreeding is the standard basic rule. When it comes to finding fossil people, is what you're saying going to push somebody to say, sooner or later, if we get enough evidence like we have with Neanderthal now, beyond a shadow of a doubt, to put him back in total human, the blue-eyed, red-haired sort of Celtic person, are you really predicting that, given enough data, even with fossil people, we will sooner or later be forced to admit they're all one species? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, and a lot of the so-called other hominids are very fragmentary and only have don't even have entire skeletons, and the same goes for classifying apes as well, where they find enough bones, they have to suddenly decide, oh, well, no, this isn't a human ancestor, it's actually a fully ape. I've got an example of that, but yes, that's part of the problem with the so-called story of human evolution. A lot of the fossils that are used to build up this family tree are very fragmentary, and and not even whole bones have been found. They're broken up and they've been put together as a sort of three-dimensional jigsaw, but you don't have the instructions as to what it's meant to look like, so you can make it into various shapes. So
In fact,
yes,
Diane,
it's a matter of evidence, and we have lots of Neanderthal evidence. For the other things that are called Homo, we don't have quite so much evidence.
Diane, would it be a good time for you to launch into your slideshow now, I think?
I think so. Yes, let's go into that for sure. Diane, are you ready? I've got your slides here ready to go.
Yes.
Just a reminder, folks, to keep those questions coming. It's a big topic. It's a long topic, and we've got plenty to discuss. So do keep those questions coming as we move forward with them. So, Diane, over to you.
Yes. This is just a brief illustration of the problem of classifying apes and people, and it's illustrated. If you ever go to the Natural History Museum in London, you'll see one of their big exhibitions, which they've had going for a while, is actually called Human Evolution. And at the entrance to this, you are confronted with this great wall of human evolution. Now, notice along this, the left-hand side there, they've got age ranges in the evolutionary timetable. And a lot of these classifications are to do with how old these things are believed to be, rather than what's the actual evidence in terms of fossils and bones that they've dug up. In general, you can see there are three main groups. We'll only look at two of these. One is the ones they call humans, and the other is another, which is the group at the top left-hand corner. And the other group is what they call Australopithecines. Now, you've probably heard of some of these. Now, you may not have heard of all of these sort of big, long names here, but you've probably heard of this one. This is the most famous, Australopithecus afarensis. In fact, this creature is better known as Lucy. Now, notice this is, if you go into the exhibition after passing through the Great Wall of Evolution there, they have the rest of the bones of this creature here, and notice the label there, an ancient relative called Lucy. So in the popular literature and the popular presentations, this creature is put forward as, well, a human relative. Not quite human, but definitely a relative, so part of our family. But that requires you to have this evolutionary mindset that somehow human beings are just animals and we are all connected. Now, that is a flat denial of what is written in the Bible, and it's important that people who want to try and put evolution and creation together remember that. Now, if we just go back to that previous slide and remember some of the skulls that John held up there, I do give credit to the Natural History Museum. They have actually shown the difference between what was actually found and what has been used to fill in the gaps between what they've actually found. Now, notice here that the light brown bits in this particular skull are what has actually been found. The dark brown shiny bits are what has been filled in. Now, notice how much has been found and how little it is compared with the entire skull. So a lot of these so-called hominids and human ancestors, there's an awful lot of imagination that's been put in between the actual finds. But let's go back to the idea of this as an ancient relative. Lucy is the nickname for this creature. It was given to it by the team that dug it up, and was apparently inspired by the pop song by the Beatles, "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds," that they were playing while they were in their camp there. Anyway, this fossil, they claim, confirmed that our ancient relatives walked upright. Well, that's actually disputed. Now notice then they say the small skull, the long arms, and the conical rib cage are like an ape. Now that should be a signal alarm bell straight away. They say she has a more human-like spine, but there's an interesting little article we have in our fact file where they took a close look at these spine bones, and they were not found all together. They are individual bones that have been put together, and they decided that one of the bones actually was probably a baboon bone. So there's a lot of wishful thinking has gone in here, where you find a collection of isolated bones and you put them together. And the same with the pelvis and the knee. They were not found together. And if we look at the whole skeleton here, you can see a lot of the bones are broken. So they do have to put them together, again, like a three-dimensional jigsaw. And but notice they said the skull was very ape-like, and it certainly is, where they have got bits of it. But particularly there, you can see the shape of the jaw. It's a very V shape that is very distinctive of an ape jaw. It's not at all like a human jaw, which has it has a parabolic shape, which is a rounded shape. So that brings us back to our genus and species classifications. The proper name for this is Australopithecus afarensis, and that literally means southern ape, from afar. So the evolutionists themselves admit this is an ape. Austral means southern, right, as meaning southern hemisphere, not just the country of Australia. So, and Pithecus means ape. So anything that gets called Australopithecus is an ape. It is fully ape, and afarensis just refers to where they found it. Now, one of the reasons they say that Lucy is a relative who was evolving into a human being and walked upright is that they found some footprints which have been ascribed to Australopithecus afarensis. Now, they can't be from the original Lucy skeleton, because it was actually found in another country. It was sort of hundreds and hundreds of miles away. But these things were found in Laetoli, and their footprints, so they had to be buried quickly, as we've talked about in some of our other programs, but they are very distinctively human-like. However, for the evolutionists, that's a problem, because they are found in rocks that have been dated as over 3 million years ago, which is the same evolutionary date that's been given to the Australopithecines. And also before they believe that modern humans evolved. So how are they going to classify these things? Well, this is one of the excuses that's used to say that Australopithecines walked upright, because whoever made these footprints certainly did walk upright. And we've written about these a few times. There have been more of them studied and found ever since the original ones were. This is a cast at the Natural History Museum of these, but they've found more of them. And even the evolutionists admit these would not attract attention on a modern beach. In other words, if you're walking along on a modern beach and left your footprints, they would look much the same as the Laetoli footprints. So they're definitely human footprints, but they don't want to admit that because they are trapped into the evolutionary timetable. So you need to take that into account as to how they're classifying things. It's not just from the shape of the bones, it's also from what they already believe in terms of the evolutionary timetable. So let's go back to our Australopithecines. So all of these things are apes. They're fully apes. And some of them we only have sort of rather fragmentary or just pieces of them. We don't have entire skeletons. But they are definitely apes. So anything that's called Australopithecus is an ape. Now, here's one that's got a little bit more publicity more recently, Australopithecus sediba, and it was proclaimed to be a missing link. That term has been thrown around, well, ever since evolution, human evolution became popular, of course. And every now and again, someone thinks, oh, we've found this missing link. So this creature, which was found more recently than Lucy goes back quite a few decades. This one was considered to be the first of the apes that was turning into people when they just found its skull, and also a rather disarticulated hand. They have since found a lot more bones, and this goes back to our problem that we talked about with Neanderthals. When you find more bones of them, they fall into being fully ape or fully human. And it's the same with this one, considered to be the best evidence for an ape that was starting to turn into a person. But when they found more bones of it, and even then, notice they don't even have an entire skeleton, and I do give credit to the Natural History Museum. They do actually show what were the bones and parts of bones that were found and which are the bits that were filled in. Now, the two limb bones, matching them by mirror imaging is quite reasonable, because we know from real whole skeletons that the two limbs, right and left, are mirror images of one another. So that's quite a reasonable thing to do. But notice that none of the bones are really intact. They've all got bits missing, so they have to be filled in. So when they got the whole skeleton of this, it has a brain size of about 420 cubic centimeters. That is about the same as a chimpanzee. A human brain is 3 times that. It had arms and legs of ape-like proportions, and that's why it's important to have entire skeletons, because it's not just the individual bone shapes you need to look at, it's also the proportions of the arms and legs. And they're very different in apes than they are from human beings. It had long curved fingers, suitable for grasping branches, and it had ape-like shin bones and an ape-like heel bone. Even though apes do have what's called a plantigrade foot, they walk on with their heel flat on the ground, but the heel has a elongated shape, which is quite different to a human one, because they don't have an arch in their foot. So let's go back to the Great Wall of Evolution and look at some of these ones that they've classified as humans. Now, we've talked about Neanderthal. That's the one that's up in the top left-hand corner. The light-coloured one that's right up there in the middle there, that's Homo sapiens. That's considered to be us. Now, that classification, Homo sapiens, sapiens, as John said, does actually mean wise. So I used to tell my students, okay, Homo sapiens, wise man. If you really want to know what the Bible says about people who call themselves wise, there's a lesson to be learnt there. I didn't tell them what it was. I'm not sure that any of them bothered to look it up, but it is a lesson to be learned, that those who call themselves wise sometimes turn out to be fools. And for the reason that they find a small amount of evidence and they jump to some very big conclusions. Now, there's one Homo here that, again, is disputable in terms of classification. And if you look over on the right-hand side, there's this one here, Homo floresiensis. I don't know whether you remember, this one got a fair bit of publicity because it was given the nickname the Hobbit. Now, the term floresiensis refers to where it was found. A lot of species names refer to where a fossil is found, or it's sometimes named after people. Or so Homo floresiensis found on the island of Flores, which is a tiny island in Indonesia. Now, here's a question for you. This is just its skull that they've got there. And it's actually quite small, but they have found some more of these bones. And but not an entire skeleton. This is not a particularly good picture of it because it is in a glass case in a very dark corner in the Natural History Museum, so I didn't get a very good shot of it there. But after they found the original bones, they went back to the various caves where this thing was found, and they have studied the individual bones and how they fit together. Now, what would you call a creature that has the brain the size of a chimpanzee, a jaw like a southern ape, right? That's like an Australopithecine, right? Arms like a gibbon or a monkey, legs like a chimpanzee or an orangutan, body proportions of a southern ape, and the body mass, in other words, they've estimated the total body mass of this thing. It was called the Hobbit because it was fairly short. It was about 3 feet tall, right? Because we have arm and leg bones, we can actually look at and skull, we can look at the brain to body proportions and the arm to leg proportions, and they turn out to be similar to a chimpanzee or a southern ape. Now, if a creature has all of these characteristics, what would you call it? It's obviously an ape. So why is it called Homo? Again, it's that dating problem. It's called Homo floresiensis right here because it is dated as being quite young in the evolutionary timetable. In fact, the bones are sort of barely fossilized in terms of not being really petrified. So they're very, very fragile. And in the cave where this thing was found, it's classified as being a lot younger than the Australopithecines, which are classified as being 3 or so million years old. So again, things get classified because of a priori beliefs that this thing was found in a young formation, therefore it has to be Homo, whereas the Laetoli footprints were found in an old formation, so they have to be Australopithecine. So we're not really looking at the actual evidence in terms of what was dug up in isolation. It is looked at in terms of the evolutionary mindset. In other words, in a priori beliefs. So there is no excuse for actually calling the Hobbit Homo. It should be classified amongst the Australopithecines. Now, all of these other things are actually fully human, as in the Neanderthals, or they are a mix of ape and human bones. And if you look at the one that's over on the right-hand side that has this great big white blotch in it, again, that's the Natural History Museum being quite honest. This was a find that got a fair bit of publicity a while ago called Homo naledi, which was a great big mass of disarticulated bones that were found in a cave in southern Africa. And they fitted these together to make some sort of partial human. But they never actually found jaw bones and the cranial part, the cranium, the top part of the skull that actually fitted together. And if you look at this great big mass of bones, some of them were ape and some of them were fully human. So if we come back to us now, if anyone else has any comments to make of these, I know, Joseph, you've seen this exhibition and you've also seen other examples from your trip to Jersey and other places. And John, you've been to the Neanderthal site.
Well, I was going to throw a bit of a curveball out there and ask John a question, because obviously what we're dealing with are mostly, you could call them fossil humans, right? Fossil or sub-fossil humans, ancient humans that are buried. And John is the only one of us who's actually dug up or been out to the site of a fossil human. When you went out and saw the fossil human that you dealt with, John, 2 questions. Number 1, how old was it supposed to be according to the geology? And number 2, would you be able to scientifically classify it as a different species of human?
Okay, the second question is very easy, since the actual skeleton is still in the basement of the British Museum. known otherwise as the Guadalupe lady. And beyond a shadow of a doubt, she not only came from Guadalupe, which is where I went to check out all the site, she's definitely a human being. She's, as I love to jokingly state, she's a stoned woman. She's buried in solidified coral. She's in rock solid base. And the most interesting comment that came out of there, because I was reporting back to Dr. Chris Stringer as the only person who's really been to this site since the 1800s to check where she came from, because it was totally unmapped. Right, the section where the fossil human came from had been left as a gap on the geological map of the island. So I went and mapped it, and I reported back to Chris and handed him the map and said she's in the stratification that the original group would have said she'd be in, millions of years old, whereas you want her to be a modern burial. I said, you'll have to deal with that yourself. But he took me down to see the skeleton. And the most interesting thing is, A, she definitely is human. And B, I asked him how many fossil people he knew of. And his answer was 30,000. And he's heard me say that in debates and on BBC TV, never contradicted me once. Perhaps a bit of qualify a little bit on fossil people. When Diane used the word not fully fossilized or permineralized or whatever, you don't need to be turned to stone to be a fossil. You just need to be dug up, right?
Yes.
In some cases, you'll find the minerals have penetrated the bone. In other cases, they've coated the bone. In other cases, like particularly even with dinosaurs, there's no minerals in the bone at all. It's just the original bone. And all of those qualify as fossils. Some are petrified. That means they've turned to stone, but you don't have to be petrified to be turned into a fossil at all. You just have to be dug up. So Guadalupe lady, definitely a fossil, definitely dug up in Bahamas. The standard interpretation these days is the natives buried her fairly recently. My saddest fossil story is I found a fossil dog on that excavation too, and brought it back to Australia, and whereby our strict classification, they couldn't believe me that I dug up a fossil dog. They only thought dogs were recent inventions, so they sterilized it. Sterilized it at about 1200 degrees, whereupon my whole fossil just collapsed into dust and powder. And I think the lady customs officer was taking her bad morning out on John Mackay, the creation guy. But nevertheless, I now have one charred packet of charred dog bones from Guadalupe. But that's what you find when you go to Guadalupe. Well, you don't, because it's what's happened there is what's happened in many places. When I went there, I was free to dig, free to excavate. Now the French authorities have cracked down, and no one's free to even sort of hunt treasure. It used to be fun going to some of these Caribbean islands, and you learned the easy way. You didn't need to dig yourself. You just stood there, dropped a few coins, and shouted, "Treasure, treasure!" And all of a sudden, a lot of little brown boys would be out and they'd dig the hole for you. So very easy digging, but you can't even do that sort of thing on many of the islands these days.
Awesome.
Yes.
Diane, can I ask you a question about DNA? I've heard other creationists speak about the Neanderthals, that now that we're doing DNA mapping, about 1 in 3 people have DNA of Neanderthals in their blood.
Yes, there are some gene variants that they've found when they've looked at Neanderthal DNA. So we're not talking about whole genes that they have that we don't. They're gene variants. Now, some of those gene variants are found in living people. So that's more evidence that Neanderthals were fully human. So yes, in fact, in every ethnic group outside of sub-Saharan Africa, you'll find some of these so-called Neanderthal gene variants.
And I like the way that you said this when we did our Around the Museum project, Diane, when we filmed with you. And by the way, we've got a lot more stuff, including an entire human skeleton now. So I'm looking forward to when we can film some more of that. But I remember one thing that I was particularly struck by is this discussion of, we've been able to sequence a Neanderthal genome. And the reality is, as you've pointed out many times, there is no such thing as a Neanderthal genome. It's a human genome with Neanderthal variants. Just as you get different, genome variants in the modern population of human beings, Neanderthal was just another variant of human being, or it was a human being with a variant of gene which is found in the modern population. So we're dealing with humans all the way through for sure. Excellent stuff. Sam, how about we have a few more questions before we move on to my little section, and then we can start to wrap things up with some final questions towards the end of the program.
Awesome. Okay. So we've got a thank you to give out. Thank you to Neil for 10 British Buckaroos. Thank you so much, Neil. And God bless you.
Thank you very much, mate.
Right. Okay. So we've had quite a few questions come in, which has been good. I've been saving those left, right, and center. So this one seems quite relevant. Comes from Show You Are. Good to see you, Shogi. Lucy has missing bones, but I have heard that there have been many Australopithecus afarensis, not just Lucy. Is it true that when they are taken as a group, they essentially have a complete skeleton?
Well, yes. The original Lucy fossil was about 40% complete. There are other fossils that are classified as Australopithecus afarensis, and yes, if you did put them all together, you would probably have a complete skeleton. But because they've done that, or because we know of that, that's actually given us all the more evidence that Lucy was an ape. And if you look up on our fact file, we've written about a few of these things where people have studied the wrist bones, the foot bones, and they've come to the conclusion that this was a tree-swinging, tree-dwelling ape-like creature, or ape, fully ape. So, yes, that is true. We have a lot of bones that are classified as Australopithecus afarensis, and that just confirms that this creature was just an ape. It's a dead ape and fully ape. There's no indication that it was evolving into a human being or had any connection with human beings. So to call it a human relative is an evolutionary fudge. It was a complete ape, and the more evidence we've got, the more we see that it was an ape.
Diane, when you were at the British Museum, is that just your last trip there when you took those pictures?
Those pictures are probably a mix of several visits because they have actually added a few things. They've added a group called Denisovians, although they don't have a skull for that one, so they've got a label up on the wall saying Denisovians. But they don't have a skull because we don't have a skull. Calling Lucy a human relative, that is still there, and the photo of the Laetoli footprints, that's from my most recent visit, which was only last year.
So therefore, if they're satisfied with their skeleton of Lucy still being accurate, then there's no need to worry about us not knowing much about Lucy, because given every bone we've got, every bone they put together, even her hands are ape-like, correct? That's why they say she can swing from a tree.
Yes. And the wrists show evidence that it was a knuckle-walking ape, right? No, apes do not walk on 4 feet like a dog with the palm, or the equivalent of the palm part of the hand down. They walk on their hands like this, except that I'm like that, so that and they've found indentations on the wrist that fit with it being a knuckle walking ape and a tree swinger. Yes, so fully ape.
I've also noticed that at the museums they'll they'll cite the 40% that Lucy's 40%, but
Mm.
there's 47 bones out of 209 for humans. That's 23%. Little off on the math. That's pretty significant.
Yes, again, they can claim that by mirror imaging the limb bones, which is a reasonable thing to do, because we know from living bones our left and our right arm, hand, and our feet are actually mirror imaging one another. But it does make it sound a lot more impressive compared with what the actual bones that they dug up is, as you say.
And one of those was a baboon bone.
And even the bones themselves aren't intact, as you saw from the photo. They're in fragments, and they've had to put them together.
Okay, let me throw in a comment, a provocative one deliberately, because we had lots of talk of scientific bits of this, that, what you can classify this or that as, but we must never forget the real aim of most of these museum displays. The intended aim is to deny God's word is true, that man alone was made in God's image, and the real cause of the problem on this planet is Adam's sin, right? And that's produced devolution, degeneration, call it what you like, but it's a downward process, and it needs a savior. The real aim of these evolutionary displays is to deny that God made man, therefore God could save us from anything because he didn't make anything. So keep that in mind, that there is a spiritual war going on here, and it's a very publicly funded war against the integrity of God's word. Joe, you got any comments on that?
No, I think that, well, just it's sad the way that you see some things going nowadays, and we'll do a little bit more of that when I talk about Neanderthals and stuff. But it's why it's so important that we grab topics like this by the horns and deal with them, and actually go into a lot of depth and show the way that both the Bible and science actually lead. I was actually going to ask you, John, if you wanted to introduce, because we've got a little video clip here from you. So I wanted to know if you wanted to introduce the little video clip, because I think that would be a good thing to go on to next.
Yes,
before we do a couple more questions.
Yeah. Okay. Now, at our new museum, the New Creation Discovery Centre, that Craig, you visited this week. Did you enjoy it?
Yeah, it's going to be great.
And our next big display, we'll be hauling over our huge fossils. I mean, one's weighing several tons usually. Big trucks needed, all this sort of stuff. We'll be taking those over and having another Supporters Day at the end of May, start of June. But until then, we'll be running homeschooling visits. So if you're a homeschooling group out here in Australia, get in touch and find out how you can come to our smaller displays in the seminar room at the New Creation Discovery Centre. But one of the means of getting PR out so they can evaluate evidence themselves, that's what the whole museum does. It makes them muse, which means to think. We don't want to just amuse them, which means to not think. We want to make them think about the creation of God. So we're producing a lot of little videos. I mean, Joseph's way ahead, Sam's way ahead in producing all these video things, but even the creation guy, he can catch up. And we've got a few people who do the filming and things like that. Hope you enjoy this little section here, which helps you on how to recognize a creation, because at the moment, that's our dominant theme. How would you recognize something was created when you fell over it? Most people sadly can't. They think there's no evidence of creation. Righto, take it away, Joe.
Here goes. Enjoy.
G'day from the creation guy John Mackay and our Creation Discovery Centre, and welcome to one of our brand new glass cabinets. Oh, I've got an important question for you. It's stuck on the outside. What connects all these objects? I mean, have a quick look. There's my stone axe collection. This is the oldest stone axe. Well, it's the first one I had anyway. And a stone chip from Western Australia, and a beautifully manicured one from the Darling Downs in Queensland. And go down a shelf. Look, we've got some Aboriginal implements. One's the zinga zinga wurra wurra, makes lots of noise, and the other is the boomerang. And look at the bottom. We have two stone tools from Africa. They're the funny ones because you throw them and they basically always land on their point. Oh, but what's between them? Can you see a nice handmade vase by an old friend of mine? You know what's interesting? Every one of these things is connected by one thing. They were all made by somebody who's not here. They were made by a brain that isn't present at the moment. They were made by someone who existed before them, someone who's not a part of them, and someone who's smarter than them. Somebody chipped the stone tools. Somebody carved the wood. Somebody took the clay and made that pot up on the Darling Downs. Why am I telling you that? Because the evidence for creation is that clear. Creation is anything that can't happen by itself. Clay doesn't make pots, any more than stone makes tools, any more than wood makes boomerangs. You do know the evidence of creation. Stop running away from it, because God holds you totally accountable for it. This is the Creation Guy. I'm in Creation Discovery Centre. Come and visit us here in South East Queensland.
Great stuff. And it's also, John, if we just talk about this very briefly, this kind of theme for the Creation Museum, because it's what I'm trying to do in our UK museums, it's what you're trying to do. I know it's what Craig is trying to do. It comes down to sort of critical thinking. So you don't give them the answer necessarily straight away. It's getting people to come in and ask the question and actually try and piece things together themselves. It's what we do on field trips and stuff like this. So this kind of theme that we're looking at, I know you've done it with dinosaurs, we've now done it with stone tools, and we've done it with apes and humans and skulls and all stuff like that. But what's the real big purpose for these museums as people come around and visit them?
Okay, well, perhaps Craig could answer that with just one illustration of the effect of these museums. Craig, take it away. Tell us a little bit of what I've asked you to talk about at church. We're preaching at the Gold Coast tomorrow. Any of you in South East Queensland, I'm sure you can come and hear us tomorrow morning down at Nerang. Hear me, hear Craig. We're on all day, so we'll look forward to seeing you. Craig, what are some of the things you're going to share?
Yeah, well, we did share a couple of these last week, but I can probably think of another one off the top of my head quite quickly. Was a lady that came into our museum actually to talk to me about seahorses, and was looking for me, so came in and listened on as I was talking to some people there, and was quite interested, and wanted to come back, and has been back several times because she brings tours to Seahorse World. And on one of the occasions, I was able to open the Bible with her and talk to her about who Jesus Christ was, because she was quite into Eastern religions and things. And then she shared with me on another visit that she had been to Sunday school growing up, had asked questions, was given insufficient answers, and walked away from it, and admitted that she tried to get back into church on a number of occasions over the years, but just couldn't get those same questions answered. And then she said, until now, you're the first person I've spoken to that has been able to answer some of these questions. And that's why we exist. That's why we're there, to help some of these people connect the dots, connect real history, connect the obvious creation that John was just referring to the God of the Bible. And she's on a journey. She's not there yet, but we've made that connection whereas Sunday school teachers and people in churches haven't been able to up to this point.
And you find the same is tragically true in the history of people like Dawkins. Ask questions at church, get no answers, wander away for the rest of their life, sadly. So that's why we exist, to not only have a reason for what we believe, but what we do believe about the hope who lies within us, who is Christ. So we don't just stop at the evidence of creation, because I love to tell people, and actually I don't like to tell them, but I've got to remind them, everybody in hell is a convinced creationist, the devil included, because he was there, right? So when you have a look at the evidence, you've got to go one step further as to who the creator is. And as Easter approaches, remember, he willingly chose to come down and die on a cross for us, his creation.
And actually, it's a good point. Speaking of Easter, rather, and creation, next week we are doing our Easter special, part 1. Yes, there are going to be 2 parts to our Easter specials over 2 weeks, so do make sure that you join us next week as we delve into the topic of Easter, Jesus, resurrection, death, burial, and Genesis connection as well. So, great stuff. All right, Sam, let's have one final question before we
carry on.
have one final question before, yes, indeed, that's right. Before
All
we
right,
carry
then.
on, and I'll go into my little presentation for the last little bit.
Okie dokie. Got a thank you to give out. Got Iron Mac coming in with 4 US buckaroos. A pair character exaggeratedly stretching his arm forward to offer a cup of coffee. Yes, I do have my cup of coffee here. Thank you very much. I'll take a drinky room.
Yes, we could do with a cup of coffee here. It's morning here, so we could do with a cup of coffee. Thank you.
Well, I've got decaf because it's nighttime, so it's all good. But anyway, right. So just following on from Shogiwar's question, I think this might be a good sort of question to ask. Neil asked this question: how do they decide which bones belong to which skeleton?
Well, the first part of that question is if they're all buried together, it's unlikely they're going to belong to other skeletons. They say that because one of the famous fossil ape-like humans in the evolutionist scenario was called human because of its toe bone. But you end up discovering the toe bone in one case was 7 or 8 miles, sort of 14, 15 kilometers away. So it's a long way to walk after the rest of your body is dead. So it's most likely they don't belong together. But if you find them all together in one hole, then the argument is clinched. Dead people don't usually get up and walk away. They may be washed away, so that in one case, one dinosaur skeleton, we found the head in one place, the body in another, and the tail, etc., in a third place. And they're obviously all the one skeleton that had been first of all buried, then washed away, petrified, and then washed away and rolled. So the last one had erosional marks on it, and you could actually see the 3 were linked together, and you could still join them together, no other options. So that's the usual pragmatic rule. Joseph, you're the other fossil digger. What do you got to comment on that one?
I mean, yeah, it's easier to work out which ones are definitely part of which skeleton than like, you know, if you dig up a dinosaur skeleton, for instance, often dinosaur bones are just fragmentary, disarticulated chunks of bone, and it can be very difficult to work out which bits belong to which, and indeed even harder to work out if one bit of bone you find and another bit of bone you find is actually even from the same dinosaur. If you do find complete or partially complete skeletons, they are usually articulated in the sense that they are actually lying in the position that they would have been when the creature was actually alive. Now, the creature may be in a dead pose, right? So the pose of the creature may not be as it was when it was alive, and you find that with the dead dino pose, right? They are very often found in provably drowned positions, you know, with the head thrown back and the tail in the air and the legs bent up underneath and so on and so forth, right? But they're still articulated because the bones are all in the same order. Now, you do find there can be crushing, there can be some disarticulation, so you often find maybe part of the leg has broken off and is maybe, you know, a few feet away or so on and so forth, but it's usually fairly easy to tell which bones belong to which skeleton. The difficulty comes with, as John has pointed out, when you find things that are vast distances away, and you've got to ask the question, okay, how much evidence are you ignoring in order to try and fit these things together in order to prove a already preconceived set of ideas? Right? If you believe that this ape skeleton that you're digging up is actually in the human evolution line and it's missing its lower half, and then a few miles away you find some very human looking feet, your evolutionary mindset is going to be trying to piece those two things together, so you've got quite literally a half human, half ape, right? And you'll find that in the history of human evolution, there have been such cases of forgery. There have been such cases of gross misidentification of animals, and yes, you've got to give it to many of the scientists. When these things were exposed, you pick up and you move along, but you do have to ask the question, how much of these issues would have been avoided if you weren't blinded by the idea of you wanting to believe this in the first place, right? It really does still make that very important point when you look at cases like Piltdown and Nebraska. Yes, science did work, and science did work well in the case of exposing the fraud and exposing the gross misidentification, but how would it have ever have become taken on in the first place if you didn't have this evolutionary mindset? All right. Let's move on then. I've got a brief presentation just to show, just to kind of round some things up before we deal with some questions before we close the evening. So I should have my slides still up on the screen there. If you can just confirm that for me, Sam. And
yeah, you're all good to go.
All good to go. Wonderful. We're asking the question, well, I've got up there, what is a race? All right. This is actually adapted from a program which we did a while back. In fact, we've done it a few times on Creation Conversations. In fact, if I recall correctly, I believe the first ever live stream we ever did, even before Creation Conversations, was actually on this topic. One blood, many races. It's a controversial topic, but it's one that is much needed to delve into and get some clarifications. But the reason why I chose to do this one, or an adaptation of this one, is because it is dealing with Neanderthals. And Neanderthals are actually one of those creatures, humans, people, whatever you want to classify them as, that many of the creationists want to try and classify as a separate species. So it's well worth delving down into it and looking a little bit deeper. Here's a little intriguing thing. When we first did this presentation, it was right back at the beginning, right, of COVID-19. We're sort of 3 years on from that, and thankfully just about over it, although the States is still fairly closed down to outsiders. It says here, DNA inherited from Neanderthals may increase risk of COVID-19. Of course, you do have to, as humorous as it is, dig a little bit deeper. DNA inherited from Neanderthals. So that means we not only can, but we have inherited DNA from Neanderthals. Now, that should tell you a lot about the relationship between Neanderthals and us. It should tell you a lot about whether they are a same or different species. But delve a little bit deeper, and we're going to find ourselves pretty quickly at a rather famous hymn. In fact, this hymn was actually used in the late great Queen Elizabeth the Great's diamond jubilee. It was a very famous hymn, beautiful hymn. Praise to the Lord, the Almighty, the King of creation. O my soul, praise him, for he is thy health and salvation. All ye who hear, now to his temple draw near. Praise him in glad adoration. All right, the author of the hymn, who actually wrote this, there he is there, Joachim Neander, 1680, a German Reformed pastor, theologian, and hymn writer. And he and his family were so famous that he actually ended up having a valley named after him, which is the Neander Valley. In fact, Neanderthal or Neanderthal actually means the Neander Valley in German. So just as Diane mentioned earlier, there's the Neander Valley or the Neanderthal, and that's where the Neanderthal skeleton was actually found. So don't be scared and worried about long and complicated and technical names. They often mean things very, very simple, and they often have a rather fascinating history behind them. And it's certainly the true for the Neanderthal skeletons. Now, since that first Neanderthal skeleton, Neanderthal 1, was found many, many years back, there's been lots and lots of other Neanderthal evidence found, both not just the skeletons, but also skeletons of children, as well as artifacts, drawings, stuff like that, which we're going to delve into a little bit now. But let's just run down through a few different ideas, because the way that we think about Neanderthals has changed over the years. You see, when Neanderthals were first discovered, evolutionary natural historians, and then later biologists, and then later anthropologists and archaeologists kind of developed the way that they thought about Neanderthal skeletons. To begin with, they believed that Neanderthals were ape men. So they believed that they were kind of missing links, right? A bit similar to how Lucy would end up being described, as Diane was talking earlier. They believed that Neanderthals were somewhere in that ancestry between apes and humans, things that were, not quite apes, not quite humans, somewhere in between. Now, it is true the first ever Neanderthal skeleton wasn't the best preserved. There were problems with it. There certainly seemed to be some kind of bone disease and stuff with it as well. But the reality is we've found so many more Neanderthal skeletons, and we found so much more evidence of Neanderthals. The old sort of creationist idea that, oh, Neanderthals were just a, arthritic sort of, human, with old man with rickets or whatever, doesn't really stand up anymore. But then neither does the evolutionary idea that they were ape men, because later they said, well, okay, maybe the Neanderthals aren't quite the missing link, but they must be human ancestors, so they're a little bit closer to being humans than perhaps before. And then they said, well, no, that doesn't really quite fit. Maybe they were distantly related to humans, so maybe the human ancestor branched off into humans and Neanderthals. And then when you start digging down into the genome and to the genetics of these kind of things, they argue that, well, actually, there's an ability to interbreed with the so-called Neanderthals and modern humans. So maybe they're distant cousins and we actually share quite a close common ancestor. And now many academic writing and many scientists consider Neanderthals as humans. In fact, they've been reclassified as Homo sapien variation neanderthalensis. And we'll talk about what that variation term means. But even without that variation neanderthalensis, which is really sort of an evolutionary terminology, leftover terminology, the reality is they're regarded by modern secular academics as Homo sapien, as human beings. And so we've ended up essentially with a complete reclassification of Neanderthals, of those skeletons first found in the Neander Valley. So Homo sapien variation, or var neanderthalensis, that's what they're now referred to as. Okay, creationist ideas. When Neanderthals were first found, in fact, one of the earliest writings said that these are just human beings. One of the earliest doctors who studied them just said, look, there's really no difference between these. Maybe there's a little bit of difference in some of the bone structure, but nothing that's big enough to be able to classify as a different species. And many people today, creationists today, promote the idea that Neanderthals were humans. Some people argue that Neanderthals were part of the one race, people who want to argue that there is only one race of man and that God created one race. There's some who argue that Neanderthals were just arthritic with bone disease due to the lack of vitamin D. Others argue that Neanderthals were just very old. So this is what happens if you get to live to, the age of Noah up to 1,000 years old, you start to look like a Neanderthal. And others claim that maybe Adam was a Neanderthal. In other words, maybe the Neanderthals are the original humans. That's what we originally looked like when God created us. And others claim that, well, actually, there's no difference between Neanderthals and us. We're just the Europeans, just a bit further down the line. Now, they're all interesting ideas, but there are some rather wacky creationist ideas as well, which we need to really put to bed. One of them is that, well, Neanderthals didn't exist. They're just forgeries. They're forgeries. They're frauds that evolutionists have made up to deny the Bible. Well, the reality is we have Neanderthal tools on display in our museum. We've studied Neanderthal bones. We have casts of the many Neanderthal skulls. One thing is for sure, Neanderthals did certainly exist. They're not hoaxes in the slightest. They are real fossils. They're real fossil humans. Neanderthals were not humans, but the genetic mutants created from demons and humans. That's another idea that we've heard bandied about. Perhaps these are, the Nephilim that Genesis 6 refers to. Well, Nephilim is an entirely different topic, which we won't get into today, but the reality is everything that we can see from their genes shows, as we mentioned earlier, it's a human genome for sure. Nothing to do with demons and angels or anything else. Other people believe that perhaps Neanderthals were the giants mentioned both in Genesis chapter 6, but also later in the book of Numbers. But, well, like I said, we've dug up Neanderthal fossils. Now, it is true that generally speaking, Neanderthal skeletons that we find are bigger, stockier, stronger, but we're certainly not talking anything that we would refer to as giants. Others believe that Neanderthals were the cause of Noah's flood, again referring back to that Nephilim idea. And then this rather interesting idea that is a fairly new one in the creationist world, that Neanderthals are a different species of human. And the reality is all of these are not only wacky, they are very, very wrong. And let's have a look a little bit deeper and find out exactly what Neanderthals are. Well, what do we know about Neanderthals? Well, like I said, we found their tools. We have many of their tools on display in our museum collections. We've now found paintings which can be attributed to Neanderthals. We obviously have skeletons, and both John and Glenn have copies of their Neanderthal or cast of their Neanderthal skeletons with them tonight. We have several casts of Neanderthal skeletons here in our UK museum collection, although not with me tonight. And John has even been to the original valley where they're found, and you can go and study in many museums around the world these actual skeletons and skulls. And perhaps most recently, the work has been done into their DNA. The bones have actually had enough preservation in them so that we can extract DNA and get a decent sequence of it. And as we mentioned earlier, the sort of term Neanderthal genome is a misnomer. It's a human genome with a Neanderthal variant, and it's well worth making sure you understand the difference between the two. Well, let's actually look through each of these pieces of evidence and see if we can work out what Neanderthals are. Are they any one of these creationist ideas? Are they any one of these evolutionary ideas? Or how can we actually get to the bottom of this? Well, there's a example of one of the Neanderthal tools that we actually have in our museum collection. It's from a very, very famous Neanderthal site in France. In fact, we've been exploring one of the Neanderthal sites on Jersey, one of the most important ones in the British Isles, just in the last few days, and we'll be bringing you some video footage of that in a little while, in the next week or so, when we've got home and edited it all together. This is a quote from the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences a couple of years back, so by no means it's a very prestigious institute. Neanderthals were not the dumb brutes once thought, but showed an incredible level of sophistication through their tool making and craftsmanship. You see, specific tool making for a purpose not only is indicative of human creativity, but it also shows you that you have an ability which apes don't have, namely that you're able to touch your all four fingers to your thumb, right? You require that to be able to grip things in certain ways, to be able to strike and create such sophisticated tools. So purely by the tools, you can't really see any difference between Neanderthals and human beings. Intelligently designed tools for an intelligent purpose certainly equals humans. I mean, think what apes can cope with. They can pick up a rock and they can smash a nut with it. They can pick up a stick and stick it in the anthill, but they don't really do much more than that. To be able to craft a tool for a specific purpose, to be able to fit it together in a handle and use it as an axe, or to be able to carve your tool so that it fits comfortably in only your left or your right hand, shows an intelligent design. An intelligent design that equals humanity. Well, Neanderthal paintings, again, reported on in the National Geographic, again, fairly prestigious. The findings suggest that Neanderthals and modern humans had the same cognitive abilities based off of their paintings. I mean, these are some of the examples from their paintings, actually fairly sophisticated stuff. And you'll often find that the anatomical drawings of animals and people in many of these cave paintings, both Neanderthals and other so-called Stone Age cave paintings, are actually far more anatomically correct than even many of the much later, medieval paintings. Intelligently designed paintings equals humanity. You see, we're dealing with something that is creative, something that is artwork, and something that requires you to have a specially created, a specially designed hand so that you're able to hold and paint and produce such things in ways that animals simply cannot. All right, well, let's have a look at their skeletons. I mean, the skeletons, yeah, you can see there's some differences in them. There's some subtle differences in the specific morphology. But then again, if you lined up the many different people groups that there are in the world, their skeletons, you'll find that some are bigger, some are skull is shaped differently, some of the bones are shaped differently. There certainly is variation. There certainly is minor changes, but certainly not anywhere near what we're dealing with when comparing a human and an ape skull together. You see, the skeleton is definitely human. It's designed to walk upright. It's designed to be able to use hands in a creative way. It's designed to be able to do the things that God created it to do because he created them in his image, just like the rest of humans. But exactly the same? Well, there are some of those minor differences. Here's one of them. In fact, one of the presentations we could have done tonight is an excellent presentation that Diane does, which I believe we've done before on Creation Conversations. It's called Brain Drain, and I recommend you go and actually find that. Maybe we'll try and find it and put it up as a standalone clip. But on the left-hand side, you can see what is often referred to as a modern human skull. On the right-hand side is the so-called Neanderthal skull. Now, can you see a difference? Well, yes, there certainly is. Every single characteristic of a human being is there in the right-hand side skull, such as the brow of the nose, which chimps don't have, such as the shape of the jaw, which chimps don't have, and this is uniquely human. Everything about it says that it is a human, but there are some differences, specifically things like the brain capacity. Yes, Neanderthals had a larger brain than modern humans. Now, if you compare that to, say, an ape skull, as both John and Diane were mentioning earlier, ape skulls generally are much, much smaller. You'll find that with Neanderthals, the bone density is stronger. Now, that's a good thing. You've got a harder head. Doesn't equal Brutus or brutishness or stupidness. It's actually a good thing. Muscle strength certainly seems to be a lot stronger, and you can tell by the way that muscles and ligaments fit into the bones. Right? If you use your dominant hand, most of us have a dominant hand, right hand, left hand. You'll find that the bones tend to be stronger and indicate good muscle strength. The size is slightly different. It's a bit larger, a bit stockier, a bit sturdier. Yes, there is a bit of a brow, and you've got that little bit of a bun on the back of the skull, but even though you've got these minor differences, which are actually indicative of a healthier and stronger and more intelligent human being, you are certainly dealing with a human from the skeleton. And finally, you have DNA. Now, what we have isolated here are the sort of number coding, which is attributed to certain gene variations which are unique to Neanderthals. They're referred to as the Neanderthal variants. They're in a human genome for sure, but here's some of the variants. Now, you'll find that if you, again, compare things like somebody from a Caucasian descent, somebody from an African descent, somebody from an Asian descent, you'll find the skin colors will be slightly different variants. You'll find that there will be different variants within these different people groups. So there's really no difference between Neanderthals and other different people groups that there are today. These are all distinct gene variations to what are referred to as modern humans, but they're all still part of the human genome. In fact, many of these variants can be found in the so-called modern humans as well. You see, this remnant DNA is found in modern humans of Northern European descent predominantly, but they are found elsewhere. They are part of human DNA, they're part of the human genome, but they are different variations from other races or people groups of human. You see, the Neanderthal is a race of human, but not a race in the evolutionary sense, certainly not a race in the species sense, but they are certainly part of the created human being. When God created Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve were originally created in the perfect image of God. However, this perfect image has become marred and corrupted by sin, as you can read about in Genesis chapter 3 and Genesis chapter 5. But these people are closer to the original creation. So they're bigger, they're stronger, and they're more intelligent. You see, the reality is Neanderthals are simply human beings, descended not only from Adam, but also from Noah, spread out at the time of the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations recorded in Genesis chapter 10 and Genesis chapter 11. Every single thing that we can see about them show that they are simply human beings, not a different species, not a different kind, a different race in the sense that we have multiple races today, different distinct human variations, but not a different species, not a different creature, not a different animal by any stretch of the imagination. John, Diane, Craig, Glenn, any comments on that before we finish up the program with a few questions?
And the brain drain thing is on our Q&A side, isn't it? Or is it on our fact file? Or is it on one of
It's not on either of those actually, but we have done it on Creation Conversations.
I'll
so
see if I can find it, and I'll pull it up as a standalone.
I believe it's actually on the research section of our website, our main web, creationresearch.net. I think the brain drain slideshow is on there. Before we had moving pictures that we use with the video clips. So yes, but it is worth everybody seeing. A question that came in from this end that you may be able to answer, Joe. Do we have any baby Neanderthals? Whole
Yes,
family?
Yeah, we do find. See, this is one of the things. There's a few different old arguments from creationist perspectives, which say that perhaps this is just what happens to humans when they get much older. Right? Perhaps they start developing these features. I think it was Jack Cusco who was a promoter of one of those ideas that perhaps Noah was a Neanderthal, because once you get over a certain age, a few hundred years, you start developing these, big eyebrows and big buns on the back of the head and so on and so forth. It doesn't quite fit because we do now have child and young adult Neanderthal skeletons, and they all have these distinct features in them. So we're definitely, just like you're born into a people group or a race today, it depends on your genetics, right? And the way that you look depends on your genetics. So just the same as you can line up. In fact, we have a rather fantastic mural which I think Diane pulled together, which is the red, brown, yellow, black and white, right? The different people from all over the world, and you can still see differences in them, even at a very, very young age. And that's good. It's good diversity, which God has created into human beings that he created them with. But it's no good just saying that, oh, well, you're not going to develop these unique characteristics until you're 200 or 300 years old, because we actually find them even in the younger skeletons that we've uncovered.
Yeah, I remember many, many years ago, just after I got involved in this sort of business, seeing a book by, I think it was an English author, an older book, in which they said if Neanderthal man walked down the street in a suit, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. And my personal testimony is I've seen kids in schools in which you would say he had enlarged eyebrows or eye bridges, right? He was out of the normal range, but yet he was obviously human. So you do see that sometimes even in European populations, but rarely.
Yeah, indeed.
Diane, have you got any comments on the genetic spread that would do that in human beings? Why would you have enlarged eyebrow ridges?
Oh, it's just variation in terms of the growth control genes as to sort of how many layers within, when the bones are growing, how many layers you form before it stops growing. So it's just variations in, not in the bone itself, but in the growth control genes that control how thick the bones get or how long they go. And you only need a very, very small variation in those control genes to get different shapes.
Good stuff. Right. Well, perhaps we'll just finish up then with one or two quick questions, Sam, before we close up for the evening. It's been a good program tonight, I feel. So, Sam, over to you for the last few thank yous and a couple of questions.
All right then. So we've got. I haven't got any more thank yous to give out, but I'll jump in with a very quick question here from Sandy C. Creation research question: does genus equate to the biblical kind?
I'll take that one since I did the first program on that. The answer is historically yes, because when Linnaeus was around and the scientific revolution was just starting, and Linnaeus and some of the others were trying to get a definable unit in botany, you find John Ray, you find Carl von Linne are sort of working along the lines of how do we do this, because you had the incredible tangle of types and names and descriptions that had been passed down to us by the ancient Greeks. I used before the illustration of words like asparagus. These were invented by the Greek people to try and describe something, or perhaps even come from an earlier culture. But when you try to define an asparagus, what do you go by? The shape, the color of the flower, the size of the stem. They just couldn't come up with any definable way to distinguish a green asparagus from a green stick insect, right? So just verbal descriptions didn't do it. Carl von Linne and John Ray together hit upon the idea of using God's distinction, because God created things separately. John Ray never got around to fulfilling that, but Carl von Linne did by using his Latin Bible, the Vulgate, and reading Genesis. It says God created things each according to, sorry, not kind, that's the English version, right? That's how you read it. But the version in Latin, which was the common version used by university students, it was the common version in many churches then, has the word genus. It's genus in Greek, because I looked it up. It's genus in Latin, because Latin and Greek are brother sister languages, and it simply means a group descended from a common generator, right? So you have genus, and every creature coming from that is in the one family. That's why when it got translated into English, they use the Old English kin, right? We have kin coming into English from things like kinder, the kids that come from you, kindergarten, the garden, you put the kids that yours in a place to play, and kin is the old word meaning a family, right? So a family group. So yes, kin and genus are actually the same words, just in different languages. So when people argue kin's a religious term and genus is not, they have no idea what they're talking about. Can I encourage you, creationists particularly, know your history, know your Bible, to see through the stupidity of many of these criticisms of that creation's got nothing to do with science. In reality, evolution has nothing to do with science, particularly in the history. Evolution did not give rise to a classification system because it's impossible. If you believe that everything comes from a common protoplasmic blob, then we're all relatives. We have no individual groups except for transitory, you're migrating from one end of the spectrum to the other. You have no definable units. That's why the Greeks had problems. They had no definable units because they already were evolutionists. It took the creationists, starting with Genesis and accepting God's word that he created them after their own kind. So we were created after the kind of God, right? We are mankind because we're made in the image of God, and we are descended from Manu, the old Indo-European word for Noah, right? Hence we take our word man, kind, put the two together. We are made after the likeness of God. We're made in the image of God. And that's why Jesus came to rescue us, because we're his kind, and he goes to remake us, right, after his likeness. And that's what brings us right up to Easter. And that's why he died on the cross, which we celebrate next week, so to restore us to his likeness. And then he told us to multiply and fill the earth after our own kind, right? Not just physically, but spiritually as well. So for those of you lazy Christians out there, get out there and tell people about Jesus. They need to be remade in his likeness, and only through Christ can they do that.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, Sam, one final question before we wrap up, because we've hit the 2-hour mark, and then it's time to finish up.
Yeah, this will probably have to be a quick one. Okay, this one comes in from Tia Othrock. Has anyone carbon-14 dated the Australopithecus bones they call Lucy?
Not as far as I'm aware. The others may have heard something, but I doubt that they would be very keen to, because even just purely going by secular standards, carbon-14 gives a maximum age of around 50,000 years. Right, that's by secular standards, right? And the Lucy fossils, the Australopithecus afarensis fossils, are dated at about 3.2 million years, right? So way older than anything that carbon-14 is supposed to last. Of course, we've done an entire program on carbon-14, and we could probably do one again. But I suspect it would be an interesting result to test some of these old fossil humans that are supposed to be millions of years old, or fossil bones anyway, that are supposed to be on the order of millions of years old, including things like the Guadeloupe woman that John worked with. But as far as I'm aware, they haven't tested it. But then I'd be very surprised if they had. You normally have to sneak these samples in with other things without telling them where you got them from. Any other comments?
I've never heard of anyone testing any Australopithecine bones by carbon-14.
No.
I think that's just about it, Joe.
Yeah. I think so, pretty much. That's grand. Okay, a reminder then, before we close, that next week we are doing part 1 of our Easter special, so make sure you tune in. We've also then got the following week, Easter special, part 2, and we've got some great programs lined up for you. They're all scheduled and ready to go. One thing I'll draw your attention to, on the 12th of May, so over a month away. But we do have Simon Turpin from Masters and Genesis UK, who's going to be on the show, and we're very much looking forward to having him on and seeing what he has to say. So schedule that into your diary now. But a reminder that next week we're dealing with our Easter special part 1, and so we're very much looking forward to seeing everybody watching there. Other than that, it's been great. It's been a good topic tonight. We've dealt with a lot of stuff, so thank you all very much. Goodbye and God bless, and we will catch you next week. Continue to support, continue to watch, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye all.
See ya.
Goodbye.